The day I caught Daniel Reynolds destroying my garden is etched into my memory like acid on metal. It wasn't just any garden. It was 20 years of my life carefully cultivated, nurtured through seasons of drought, frost, and personal heartbreak. That garden had been my sanctuary since my husband Robert passed away, leaving me to navigate widowhood in a neighborhood that had slowly transformed around me. I remember standing frozen at my kitchen window, coffee mug suspended midair, as I watched Daniel, our neighborhood's golden boy and self-proclaimed real estate genius, drive his excavator straight through my prize-winning roses. Not accidentally, not with regret, but with purpose, his jaw set in determination as he plowed a jagged path through 2 decades of memories. "What the hell are you doing?" I screamed, running outside still wearing my garden slippers, my voice cracking as I watched him crush my meticulously grafted David Austin roses, varieties so rare they'd taken years to source and cultivate. The morning sun glinted off the metal tracks of his machine as it tore through my carefully amended soil, crushing delicate root systems and destroying the intricate irrigation system Robert had installed before cancer took him from me. Daniel barely glanced up, the excavator's engine drowning out my protests as he shouted back, "This is technically my property, Eleanor. Check the survey markers if you don't believe me." His voice carried that smugness I'd come to recognize from our neighborhood meetings, the tone of someone who believed money could justify anything. I stood there trembling, dirt already caking under my fingernails from where I'd desperately tried to save a cluster of bleeding hearts that Robert and I had planted on our 5th anniversary. "There must be some mistake," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "This garden has been here for 20 years. We discussed the property line with your father when he lived here." Daniel killed the engine and climbed down, dressed impeccably, in clothes that seemed entirely inappropriate for destroying someone's life work. Designer jeans that had never seen real dirt, and a button-down shirt with rolled-up sleeves that screamed casual wealthy. He smirked, pulling a folded document from his back pocket. "There's no mistake, Eleanor. I had the property resurveyed last month. This strip," he gestured to what was once my eastern flower bed, "extends exactly 3.7 feet into what you thought was yours. I need this space for the new driveway expansion. The HOA already approved the preliminary plans." I felt my chest tighten. The Homeowners Association. Of course, the same organization that had fined Mrs. Jenkins, a 78-year-old widow, for having a bird feeder that didn't conform to neighborhood aesthetic standards. The same group that had denied the Patels' request to install solar panels because they weren't in keeping with the historical character of houses built in the 1990s. "You could have talked to me first," I said, bending down to rescue a mangled hydrangea that Robert had brought home from a business trip to Japan. Its roots dangled exposed, soil crumbling away from them. "This didn't have to happen this way." Daniel checked his watch, a flashy piece that probably cost more than my monthly pension. "Look, I did you a favor by doing this myself instead of sending the crew. They wouldn't have been nearly as careful." He gestured to the devastation around us, crushed flowers, broken trellises, and irrigation pipes spurting water into the churned soil. "The property lines are clear. I need this space. End of story." I clutched the damaged hydrangea to my chest, its once vibrant blue flowers now muted with dust. "This garden is all I have left of him," I whispered, more to myself than to Daniel. If he heard me, he didn't show it. He was already climbing back into the excavator, phone pressed to his ear. "Yeah, Tom, we're good to go on the Reynolds property expansion. The encroachment has been cleared." He revved the engine, drowning out whatever else I might have said. I stood there in the wreckage of my garden, my sanctuary, and felt something harden inside me. The neighborhood had changed so much since Robert and I had first moved in. Back then, it had been a community of modest homes occupied by teachers, firefighters, nurses, people who waved when you walked by and brought soup when you were sick. Now, one by one, those homes had been bought, expanded, and transformed into showcase properties by people like Daniel Reynolds, people who saw houses as investments rather than homes. and neighbors as obstacles rather than community. That evening, as I sat on my back porch surveying the damage, my phone rang. It was Marjorie from across the street, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Eleanor, I just heard what happened. That man is a menace. First the Garcia's shared driveway, now your garden. Who does he think he is?" I sighed, watching the sunset cast long shadows across what remained of my garden. Someone who knows how to work the system, apparently. "Well, it's about time the system worked against him for once," Marjorie said, her voice taking on that determined tone I recognized from our days organizing the Neighborhood Watch program. "Did you know Howard Prescott is stepping down as HOA president?" I frowned, only half listening as I noticed a hummingbird hovering confusedly where my trumpet vine used to climb. "Howard's leaving?" I thought he was determined to die in that position. Apparently his daughter's moving him to Arizona. Something about his arthritis. There was a pregnant pause before Marjorie continued. "A few of us were talking, and we think you should run for the position." The suggestion was so unexpected, I actually laughed. "Me? Marjorie, I've spent the last 15 years actively avoiding HOA politics. Those meetings are toxic." "Exactly why we need someone like you," she pressed. "Eleanor, the balance of power in this neighborhood has shifted. The old families are being pushed out by these developers and flippers. People who don't care about community, only property values. Howard was the last thing standing between them and total control." Watched as the hummingbird finally gave up and flew away. "And you think I could make a difference?" "I think you're the only one who would try," Marjorie said simply. "Besides, word has it that Daniel Reynolds is planning to run for the position himself. Can you imagine what he'd do with that kind of power?" Something cold settled in my stomach. Daniel Reynolds as HOA president would transform our neighborhood into a sterile showcase of wealth and pretension faster than we could blink. And anyone who couldn't keep up, the retired teachers, the single parents, the original families who'd built this community, would be fined and regulated until they had no choice but to sell. To people like him. "The election's in 2 weeks," Marjorie continued when I didn't immediately respond. "Just think about it, okay? Some of us still believe this neighborhood is worth fighting for." After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness, watching fireflies begin to rise from what remained of my flower beds. Robert and I had chosen this neighborhood 25 years ago because it felt like somewhere we could put down roots. Somewhere we could grow old together. The irony that he was gone and now those literal and figurative roots were being ripped up wasn't lost on me. I thought about the other changes I'd witnessed since Daniel and his type had moved in. The elderly couple, down the block, who could no longer afford the increased HOA fees after the association mandated expensive new fencing for everyone. The young family who'd received violation notices for their children's modest swing set. The constant pressure to maintain a certain appearance regardless of personal circumstance or cost. My phone buzzed with a text from Marjorie. "Just heard. Reynolds filed his HOA candidacy paperwork today. We need you, Eleanor." I sighed, looking out at the destruction that had once been my pride and joy. Something Robert had said years ago came floating back to me. Sometimes the best way to fix a broken system is from the inside. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, made myself a strong cup of coffee, and sat at my kitchen table staring at a blank piece of paper. "Eleanor Bennett for HOA president," I wrote at the top, then immediately crossed it out. Too formal. "Eleanor. For a neighborhood that works for everyone." Better, but still not quite right. I glanced out the window at what remained of my garden and felt that hardness from yesterday crystallize into something more purposeful. Daniel Reynolds had taken something precious from me without a second thought. But in doing so, he'd also handed me something unexpected. Clarity. "Preserving our community's roots," I finally wrote. It felt right, honoring what had been while acknowledging what could still be. By 10 a.m., I was standing in the HOA office filing my candidacy paperwork. The secretary, a young woman I didn't recognize, seemed surprised. "You're running against Mr. Reynolds?" she asked, her eyebrows rising slightly. "That's right," I said, pushing my completed forms across the desk. "It's just, he's very involved with property development," she said carefully. "He has a lot of supporters in the neighborhood." I smiled tightly. "So do I." "Well, good luck," she said, in a tone that suggested I'd need more than luck to compete with Daniel Reynolds and his connections. Perhaps she was right. Daniel was wealthy, well-connected, and ruthlessly effective. I was a 62-year-old retired high school librarian whose most notable achievement in recent years was growing a Japanese wisteria that had been featured in a regional gardening magazine. But I also knew something Daniel didn't. I knew every family in this neighborhood, not just the new money, but the original families who'd built this community. I'd helped Mrs. Peterson navigate her Medicare paperwork after her husband died. I'd tutored the Williams children through their college applications. I'd organized meal deliveries when Mr. Abernathy was undergoing chemotherapy. These weren't just neighbors to me. They were friends, almost family. And while they might not have Daniel's money or influence, they had votes. I walked home with a strange sense of purpose I hadn't felt since Robert's diagnosis 5 years ago. My garden might be partially destroyed, but perhaps something new could grow from the devastation, something stronger and more resilient than before. That evening, my doorbell rang just as I was finishing dinner. I opened it to find Daniel Reynolds standing on my porch, still in his business attire, a thin smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes. "Eleanor," he said, his tone falsely warm. "I heard the interesting news today. You're running for HOA. President." I crossed my arms. "That's right." He nodded slowly, looking past me into my home as if assessing its value. "Bold move. I just wanted to stop by and make sure there are no hard feelings about yesterday. Business is business, after all. Is that what destroying someone's garden is to you? Business?" I kept my voice level despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. Daniel had the decency to look momentarily uncomfortable. "The property line is clear, Eleanor. I need that space for my driveway expansion. The HOA has already preliminarily approved my renovation plans." "Preliminarily," I emphasized. "Nothing's final until the permits are issued." Something flickered in his eyes, a momentary calculation, quickly masked by another practiced smile. "Right. Well, I just wanted to wish you luck in the election. It's good for the community to have options." He turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and just so you know, I've extended invitations to all the homeowners for a backyard barbecue this weekend. Campaign event of sorts. You're welcome to come, of course." The invitation was so transparently tactical, I almost laughed. "I'll check my calendar," I said flatly. After he left, I called Marjorie. "Daniel Reynolds just stopped by," I told her. "He's hosting a campaign barbecue this weekend." "Of course he is," Marjorie sighed. "He'll probably serve imported Wagyu beef and hire staff to circulate with champagne. We need to counter this, Eleanor." "With what? I can't compete with that kind of display." There was a pause before Marjorie spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "No, but you can offer something he can't. Authenticity. Community. Remember that potluck we used to have every summer when the neighborhood was first built? The one where everyone would bring dishes representing their heritage? I did remember. It had been a beautiful tradition. Tables stretching down the community center lawn, loaded with everything from Mrs. Petrovich's stuffed cabbage rolls to the Wong's incredible dumplings to my own grandmother's peach cobbler. Children running between tables, sampling everything. Neighbors sharing recipes and stories. It had faded away as the neighborhood changed, as people became busier and more isolated. "We could revive it," I said slowly, the idea taking shape. Not just as a campaign, event, but as a reminder of what this community used to be, what it could be again. "Exactly," Marjorie said, excitement creeping into her voice. "I'll make some calls tonight. We'll host it at the community center the day before Daniel's fancy barbecue. Let people choose what kind of neighborhood they want to live in." After we hung up, I walked out to what remained of my garden in the fading evening light. The destruction was still painful to see, but I noticed something I'd missed before. Among the churned soil and broken stems, tiny green shoots were already pushing upward, plants refusing to surrender, roots still alive beneath the surface, reaching for the light. I knelt down, gently pressing soil around the exposed roots of survivors, giving them a fighting chance. As I worked, a plan began to take shape in my mind, not just for winning an HOA election, but for reclaiming the soul of a neighborhood that had lost its way. The next morning, I woke to the sound of heavy machinery again. I rushed to my window, heart pounding, afraid Daniel had returned to finish what he'd started. Instead, I saw a small group of my neighbors, the Patels with their teenage sons, Mr. Abernathy leaning on his cane, the Garcia family, and several others carefully working in what remained of my garden. Some were salvaging plants, others were clearing debris, and Mr. Garcia was examining the damaged irrigation system with the focused expression of someone who knew exactly how to fix it. Marjorie stood in the center of it all, clipboard in hand, directing the impromptu restoration effort. When she saw me at the window, she waved me outside. "What is all this?" I asked, overwhelmed by the sight of so many neighbors I hadn't seen, together in years, all working in my yard. "This," Marjorie said with satisfaction, "is the beginning of your campaign, and a reminder to everyone of what happens when we let people like Daniel Reynolds set the agenda for our neighborhood." She handed me a mug of coffee. "Also, we've ordered campaign signs. They'll be ready tomorrow." I looked around at my neighbors, working together, talking and laughing despite the serious purpose that had brought them here. Mrs. Patel was carefully transplanting salvaged perennials into temporary pots. The Garcia children were collecting broken pieces of my hand-painted garden markers, trying to match them back together. Even old Mr. Abernathy, who could barely walk without his cane, was sitting on a garden stool sorting through salvaged bulbs. For the first time since Daniel's excavator had torn through my garden, I felt something lighten in my chest. This connection, this community care, was what I was truly fighting for. Not just property lines or HOA regulations, but the soul of a neighborhood where people looked out for each other. "Thank you," I said to Marjorie, my voice thick with emotion. "All of you." "Don't thank us yet," she replied with a determined smile. "We've got an election to win and a garden to rebuild. And," she lowered her voice, "a certain developer to put in his place." I nodded, rolling up my sleeves and stepping forward to join my neighbors in the work of restoration. Whatever happened with the election, in this moment I knew with absolute certainty that something important had already been reclaimed. And it wasn't just my garden. The battle lines had been drawn. Daniel Reynolds had destroyed something precious. To me, without a second thought, operating under the assumption that power and money would shield him from consequences. He'd never expected me to fight back. Certainly not by challenging him for control of the very system he'd been manipulating. But he'd made a critical error. In tearing up my garden, he hadn't just attacked my property. He'd attacked a symbol of what our neighborhood had once been and could be again. And in doing so, he'd inadvertently planted the seeds of his own defeat. Because while Daniel Reynolds might have money and connections, I had something far more powerful. A community ready to reclaim its roots. And unlike the flowers he'd so carelessly destroyed, this was one growth he wouldn't be able to bulldoze away. Word of my candidacy spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By the following afternoon, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Old neighbors I hadn't spoken to in months calling to offer support, stories about their own run-ins with Daniel Reynolds, and questions about what kind of HOA president I would be. "Izzo, it true you're going to stop all these McMansion renovations?" asked Bill Thatcher, who'd lived 3 doors down since the neighborhood was first built. His modest ranch-style home now sat between two towering modern structures that blocked his garden sunlight. "I can't promise to stop all renovations," I told him honestly, "but I can promise to make sure the approval process considers the impact on neighbors, not just property values." That seemed to satisfy him, and similar conversations played out throughout the day. I quickly realized I needed to develop a clear platform, something beyond just opposing Daniel Reynolds. I called an impromptu meeting at my house that evening. To my surprise, 15 neighbors showed up, crowding into my living room with notepads and determined expressions. These weren't just my friends. They included people like the young Chen family who had moved in last year, and even Mrs. Prescott, Howard's wife, who had always been politically neutral in neighborhood matters. "I'm running because I believe our neighborhood is at a crossroads," I began, standing awkwardly in front of my own fireplace. "For years, the HOA has increasingly focused on aesthetic uniformity and property values at the expense of actually serving the people who live here." Heads nodded around the room. "But I can't just be against things," I continued. "I need to offer solutions. That's why I need your help, to identify what our community actually needs." For the next 2 hours, my living room transformed into a think tank. Issues I hadn't even considered came pouring out. The rising HOA fees that were straining fixed-income residents. The selective enforcement of regulations that seemed to favor certain homeowners. The community center that sat largely unused because programming had been cut to fund aesthetic improvements to the neighborhood entrance. Mrs. Jenkins, still bitter about her bird feeder violation, leaned forward in her seat. "You know what really gets me? They fine me $100 for having the wrong color bird feeder, but when the Millers put up that enormous boat in their driveway for 3 months, suddenly the rules were open to interpretation." "That's because Peter Miller is on the Architectural Review Committee," Mr. Patel pointed out. "The same committee that fast-tracked Daniel Reynolds's preliminary approval for his driveway expansion." Jotted notes frantically, a plan beginning to take shape. "So we need clear, consistent enforcement of the rules, regardless of who you are or who you know." By the end of the evening, we had outlined a 5-point platform: transparent governance, fair enforcement, reasonable fees, community-focused spending, and a commitment to preserving neighborhood character while allowing thoughtful change. As people prepared to leave, Marjorie handed out assignments: who would make calls, who would distribute flyers, who would coordinate the community potluck we'd planned for the weekend. There was an energy in the room I hadn't felt in our neighborhood in years. Mrs. Prescott lingered after the others had gone. "You know," she said quietly, "Howard always said the HOA presidency was a thankless job. Years of service. And what did he get? Reynolds and his friends gradually taking over every committee until Howard could barely get a word in edgewise." I hesitated, a question forming that I wasn't sure I should ask. "Mrs. Prescott, did Howard really step down because of his arthritis?" She gave me a long look, then sighed. "No. He stepped down because they were going to force him out. Reynolds and his friends arranged a vote of no confidence. They had the numbers. Moving to Arizona was more dignified." My stomach tightened. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." "No one knows," she said, gathering her purse. "And I'd appreciate if it stayed that way. But you should understand what you're up against, Eleanor. These people play to win." After she left, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by the remnants of our meeting: coffee mugs, notebooks, a whiteboard filled with ideas. Mrs. Prescott's warning echoed in my mind. What exactly had I gotten myself into? The next morning brought the first sign of just how dirty this campaign might get. As I stepped outside to collect my newspaper, I noticed a bright yellow paper tucked under my windshield wiper. At first, I thought it was some kind of parking violation, but as I got closer, I realized it was a flyer. "Attention homeowners," it read in bold black letters. "Did you know that Eleanor Bennett's property has been cited for multiple landscape violations in the past? Now she wants to run the HOA? Can we trust someone who can't even maintain their own property to uphold our community standards? At the bottom, in smaller print, paid for by concerned residents for community excellence. I stood frozen on my driveway, the flyer trembling slightly in my hand. The violations they referred to had occurred during Robert's illness, when maintaining a perfect lawn had been the furthest thing from my mind. The HOA had eventually waived those citations after several neighbors intervened on my behalf. A car slowed as it passed my house, and I looked up to see Mrs. Garcia giving me a concerned wave. She pulled over and rolled down her window. "They're on every car in the neighborhood," she said grimly. "My husband is already going around collecting them." I forced a smile. "It's fine. This is just the beginning, I'm sure." "It's not fine," she insisted. "It's cruel. Everyone knows why you had those violations, using your husband's illness against you." She shook her head in disgust. By mid-morning, my phone was ringing again, this time with indignant neighbors reporting similar flyers and offering to help remove them. Mr. Abernathy called to say he'd seen 2 college-aged boys distributing them at dawn and had confronted them, but they claimed they were just doing a paid job and didn't know anything about the content. Just before noon, my doorbell rang. When I opened it, I found Sophia Chen, an attorney who had moved into the neighborhood last year. I knew her only in passing. She and her husband both worked long hours and hadn't been very involved in community matters. "I saw the flyers," she said without preamble. "It's defamation, and it's illegal without proper campaign disclosure. If you want to pursue it, I'd be happy to help." I invited her in, surprised by the offer. "Thank you, but I don't want this campaign to turn into a legal battle." She nodded, setting her briefcase on my coffee table. "I understand, but you should know your rights. And you should also know that I received a very interesting phone call last night." "From whom?" "Daniel Reynolds." She sat down, smoothing her skirt. "He's offering me a seat on the Architectural Review Committee if I support his candidacy. Mentioned that he was aware of our interest in adding a home office extension." I raised my eyebrows. "That sounds like quid pro quo?" "Absolutely." She smiled thinly. "I told him I'd consider it." "I thought you might want to know who you're dealing with." "Why tell me this?" I asked, genuinely curious. "You barely know me." Sophia's professional demeanor softened slightly. "Because last winter, when we were away and our pipes burst, you were the one who organized the cleanup and repair crew before we even got back. You didn't know us either, but you helped anyway." She stood to leave. "That's the kind of neighborhood I want to live in." After she left, I called Marjorie with an update. "We need to accelerate our plans," I told her. "The potluck needs to happen tomorrow, not this weekend. And I need to make a public statement addressing these flyers before they define the narrative." By that evening, we had sent electronic invitations to every house in the neighborhood for an emergency community potluck at the community center the following day. We'd secured the space through Mrs. Prescott, who still had access to her husband's keys and booking privileges, a fact we decided not to advertise. I spent that night drafting and redrafting my statement, trying to find the right balance between defending myself and not appearing defensive. Robert would have known exactly what to say. He'd always been better with words than I was. As a high school history teacher, he'd had a gift for making complex issues accessible without oversimplifying them. "Don't overcomplicate things," he would have told me. "This isn't about HOA politics or property disputes. It's about what kind of community we want to live in." I fell asleep at my desk, his voice still echoing in my mind, and woke with newfound clarity about how to approach the day ahead. The community center was already buzzing with activity when I arrived at 11 a.m. Marjorie had organized a small army of volunteers who were setting up tables, hanging simple decorations, and arranging a sign-in table near the entrance. The potluck wasn't scheduled to begin until noon, but people were already arriving with dishes, eager to help and to talk. The Reynolds' side has been calling people all morning, Mrs. Patel informed me as she arranged samosas on a platter. Telling them this is an unauthorized use of the community center and they shouldn't come. I felt a flicker of anxiety. Is it working? She laughed. Does it look like it's working? She gestured around the room where at least 30 neighbors were already gathered, with more streaming in. By noon, the community center was fuller than I'd seen it in years. Long tables groaned under the weight of home-cooked dishes. Everything, from Mrs. Wong's legendary dumplings to Mr. Abernathy's prize-winning chili. Children darted between tables. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in months caught up with each other, and the room hummed with conversation and laughter. I stood by the entrance, greeting people as they arrived, when a hush fell over the room. I turned to see Daniel Reynolds standing in the doorway, surveying the scene with barely concealed displeasure. Behind him stood Peter Miller from the Architectural Committee and several other members of his clique. "Eleanor," he said, flashing that practiced smile that never reached his eyes. "Quite the gathering you've managed to put together. On rather short notice." "Community tends to come together quickly when motivated," I replied evenly. "Would you like to come in? There's plenty of food for everyone." He hesitated, clearly thrown by the invitation. I could see him calculating the optics of refusing versus the discomfort of accepting. "We'd be delighted," he finally said, though his tone suggested otherwise. As Daniel and his group entered, I tapped a glass to get everyone's attention. The room gradually quieted, all eyes turning toward me. "Thank you all for coming today, especially on such short notice," I began. "Many of you have seen the flyers that appeared on cars yesterday. Rather than address them directly, I'd like to speak about why I'm running for HOA president." I paused, scanning the room. Daniel had positioned himself near the back, arms crossed, watching me intently. 25 years ago, my late husband Robert and I chose this neighborhood because we felt a sense of community here. People looked out for each other. The HOA existed to serve the residents, not to dictate to them. Over time, that balance has shifted. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Some of you have been fined for bird feeders or garden decorations while watching larger violations go unaddressed. Some of you have been shocked by rising HOA fees that don't seem to benefit actual residents. Some of you have watched helplessly as the character of our neighborhood changed, not through natural evolution, but through calculated efforts to maximize property values at the expense of livability. I could see people nodding, exchanging glances with their neighbors. I'm not running on a platform of preventing change. Change is inevitable. I'm running on a platform of making sure that change serves all of us, not just those with the most money or influence. My eyes found Daniel, who was now shifting uncomfortably. Yesterday, someone tried to use my husband's illness against me, suggesting that landscape violations during his cancer treatment somehow disqualified me from leadership. I think that action reveals exactly what's at stake in this election. Whether we want to be a community that supports each other through hard times, or one that exploits vulnerability for personal gain. The room had gone completely silent. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. I believe in transparency, fairness, and genuine community. If elected, I promise that HOA decisions will be made in the open. Rules will be enforced consistently regardless of who you are. Fees will be reasonable, and spending will focus on what actually improves residents' lives, not just property values. I took a deep breath, reaching the most important part of my message. This potluck represents the neighborhood I remember, and the one I believe we can be again, where we share food and conversation, where we learn about each other's cultures and backgrounds, where we see each other as neighbors rather than just adjacent property owners. This is what I'm fighting for. I raised my glass. So thank you for coming today. Whether you vote for me or not, being here shows that you care about more than just property values. You care about community, Now, let's eat before all this wonderful food gets cold. The room erupted in applause and conversation as people turned to their neighbors, discussing what they'd heard while filling their plates. I made my way through the crowd, stopping to chat with as many people as possible, answering questions about my platform, and listening to concerns. From the corner of my eye, I could see Daniel working the room as well, his charm offensive in full swing as he moved from group to group. But there was a stiffness to his interactions, a forced quality to his smile that hadn't been there before. He's realizing this won't be the easy victory he expected, Marjorie murmured as she passed by with a tray of desserts. Look at Miller's face. He's positively grim. She was right. Peter Miller, Daniel's right-hand man on the architectural committee, was standing by the exit, checking his watch repeatedly, his expression darkening as he surveyed the crowd of neighbors eating and talking together. As the event began winding down, Sophia Chen approached me, a knowing smile on her face. Impressive turnout, and even more impressive speech. Thank you, I said, suddenly exhausted now that the adrenaline was wearing off. Do you think it made a difference? Look around, she replied. People who haven't spoken to each other in years are exchanging phone numbers. The Garcias and the Millers, who had that terrible fence dispute last year, were just laughing together over dessert. You've already made a difference, regardless of the election outcome. As I helped clean up after the last guests had departed, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. We need to talk. Meet me at Parkview Coffee tomorrow, 9 a.m. Come alone. Howard Prescott. I stared at my phone in surprise. Howard Prescott, the former HOA president, wanted to meet with me? He hadn't attended the potluck. In fact, according to Mrs. Prescott, he was already in Arizona. So, why was he texting me now? I showed the message to Marjorie, who frowned. Could be a trap. Reynolds' people might be using Howard's name to get you alone somewhere. Or it could be legitimate, I mused. Maybe he's in town tying up loose ends before the permanent move. Either way, you shouldn't go alone, she insisted. I'll sit at another table, keep an eye out. As we finished loading the last of the serving dishes into my car, Daniel approached, his small entourage having already departed. Without his audience, he seemed smaller somehow, less certain. Quite the performance today, Eleanor, he said, his tone conversational but with an undercurrent of tension. You've got everyone believing you're fighting for the soul of the neighborhood. Very moving. It wasn't a performance, Daniel. I meant every word. He laughed softly, shaking his head as if I were a child who didn't understand how the world worked. This isn't about community potlucks or neighborly goodwill. This is about property values and investment protection. Do you even understand? What would happen to this neighborhood without strict architectural controls? Without consistent aesthetic standards? Property values would plummet. Your home's equity, your greatest asset, would evaporate. Some things are worth more than property values, I replied. Like actually being able to live in your home without fear of arbitrary fines or selective enforcement. He stepped closer, his voice dropping. Let me be blunt, Eleanor. You're out of your depth. Running the HOA isn't like organizing a book club or a garden tour. It's essentially running a small government, with legal responsibilities, financial obligations, and liability concerns you can't even imagine. Is that a threat? It's a reality check, he said, straightening his jacket. There's still time to withdraw from the election. Save yourself the embarrassment. After all, even if by some miracle you win, you'll still need to work with people. Like me on the board. People who understand the real issues at stake. I thought of my destroyed garden, of Howard Prescott being forced out, of all the neighbors who had been bullied or fined or made to feel unwelcome in their own community. I appreciate your concern, I said evenly, but I think I'll stay in the race. His expression hardened. Your choice. Just remember, when this gets ugly, and it will get ugly, you're the one who chose this path. As he walked away, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Daniel Reynolds wasn't just confident, he was accustomed to getting his way, to bending rules and people to his will. And he clearly believed he had resources at his disposal that I couldn't match. What exactly had Howard Prescott discovered that made them force him out? And what would Daniel Reynolds do if he felt truly threatened? I looked down at my phone again, rereading Howard's text. Whatever information he had, it seemed I wasn't the only one who thought it might change the course of this election. The question was, would I get to him before Daniel Reynolds realized he was back in town? Parkview Coffee was unusually quiet when I arrived the next morning at 8:45 a.m. I chose a table in the back corner with a clear view of both the entrance and the street outside. As promised, Marjorie had arrived 10 minutes earlier and was seated across the room, pretending to be absorbed in her tablet while sipping a latte. At precisely 9 a.m., the door swung open. My breath caught, but instead of Howard Prescott, I saw Daniel Reynolds stride in, dressed in an expensive-looking running outfit, earbuds in place. He didn't seem to notice me as he ordered his coffee and left. Coincidence? Marjorie mouthed from across the room, raising her eyebrows. I shrugged, trying to ignore the unease settling in my stomach. By 9:15, I was beginning to think the message had indeed been some kind of setup. I was about to signal to Marjorie that we should leave when a text message appeared on my phone. Back booth at Miller's Diner. Now, saw Reynolds at the coffee shop. Not safe. HP. My unease deepened. Miller's Diner was 5 blocks away. Not far, but definitely not where we had agreed to meet. Was this another attempt to isolate me? Or was Howard genuinely concerned about being seen by Daniel? I showed Marjorie the message. I don't like it, she said immediately. This feels like they're trying to separate us. Then come with me, I suggested. You can wait outside the diner, keep watch. 10 minutes later, we stood across the street from Miller's Diner, an old-fashioned establishment that had somehow survived the neighborhood's gentrification. Through the window, I could see the back booth was occupied by an elderly man in a baseball cap pulled low over his face. That could be anyone, Marjorie whispered. I still think this is fishy. I'm going in, I decided. Call me in 15 minutes with an emergency, if I'm not out by then. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, causing the man in the back booth to look up sharply. It was indeed Howard Prescott, though he looked significantly older than when I'd last seen him at an HOA meeting 3 months ago. His face was drawn, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. Eleanor, he said, his voice lower than I remembered. Thank you for coming. Sit down, please. I slid into the booth across from him. Your text said you were in Arizona. I was. Flew back last night. He glanced nervously toward the entrance. Didn't tell anyone except Martha and made her promise to keep it quiet. Why all the secrecy, Howard? He pulled a manila envelope from inside his jacket and placed it on the table, keeping his hand firmly on top of it. Because of this. And because I know what they did to your garden. My eyes widened. What do you know about that? I know Reynolds had the property resurveyed specifically to target that strip of land. I know he pushed it through the architectural committee without proper notification to adjacent property owners, which is against our own bylaws. And I know. Why? I leaned forward. Why? Howard's voice dropped even lower. Because your garden was becoming a problem for his expansion plans. Not just the driveway, the whole project. He wants to essentially double the footprint of his house, extending toward your property line. Your garden, especially those tall Japanese maples and that wisteria arch, would have blocked the scenic view from his planned solarium. My hands clenched into fists beneath the table. He destroyed 20 years of work for a scenic view? For property value, Howard corrected. Each unobstructed view adds thousands to a home's appraisal, but that's just the beginning. He tapped the envelope. Do you know why I really stepped down as HOA president? I hesitated, remembering Mrs. Prescott's words. Your wife said they forced you out. Some kind of vote of no confidence? That's the official story. He nodded. The truth is, I discovered something they didn't want found. He finally slid the envelope across the table. Reynolds and his developer friends have been planning a complete overhaul of the neighborhood. They've been working on it for almost 2 years. I opened the envelope and pulled out several documents. The first was a glossy brochure with Oakwood Estates, a premier living experience, emblazoned across the top. I recognized the name. It was a high-end development company known for luxury communities. Turn to page 3, Howard instructed. I did, and found myself looking at a sleek architectural rendering of what appeared to be our neighborhood, but transformed almost beyond recognition. The modest homes were replaced with sprawling mansions. The community center and park had been converted into a private clubhouse and pool. A gate stood at the entrance. They're planning to convert the entire neighborhood into a gated luxury community, Howard explained. They've been buying up houses, strategically for the past 5 years, waiting until they control enough properties to force through changes to the HOA agreement. I flipped through the rest of the brochure, a sickening feeling growing in my stomach. How could they possibly do this? They would need approval from a supermajority of homeowners. Not if they own enough properties, Howard said grimly. Look, at the ownership records in the back of the packet. I turned to the documents behind the brochure, a list of property addresses with corresponding owner names. What I saw made my blood run cold. At least 15 homes in our neighborhood, nearly a third, were owned by various LLCs and investment companies. Next to each was a small notation, affiliated with Oakwood Ventures. They're shell companies, Howard explained, all controlled by the same investment group that includes Reynolds, Miller, and 3 other homeowners on the current board. They've been buying properties quietly, sometimes when they go on the market, sometimes by approaching owners directly with offers well above market value. That's why the Thompsons sold so quickly last year, I murmured, remembering how surprised everyone had been when the elderly couple had moved out almost overnight. And the Jacksons before them. Howard nodded. Once they control 51% of the voting rights, they can essentially rewrite the HOA agreement, force through special assessments that the remaining original homeowners can't afford, change architectural guidelines to require renovations beyond what most people can pay for. Forcing people to sell, I finished, the full picture becoming horrifyingly clear. Exactly. Then they buy the properties at a discount, because who else would purchase a home with thousands in pending HOA assessments? Renovate according to their master plan and resell at massive profit. I sat back, struggling to process what I was hearing. But this is perfectly legal, if ethically reprehensible, Howard cut in. I confronted Reynolds about it when I found these documents misfiled in the HOA records. That's when the pressure started. First, subtle threats about liability issues if certain information became public. Then not-so-subtle suggestions that my management of HOA finances might not stand up to scrutiny. Were they bluffing? Howard's face darkened. Not entirely. As president, I had authorized emergency repairs to the community center roof 2 years ago without getting competitive bids. It was leaking badly, and I used a contractor I trusted who could start immediately. Technically against procedure, but no money was misappropriated. They were prepared to make it look like embezzlement. So you resigned rather than fight. I'm 72 years old, Eleanor. I don't have the energy for that battle. He gestured to the documents. But when I heard you were running against Reynolds, I knew I had to come back. You need to understand what you're really fighting against. I gathered the papers, my mind racing. Why are you showing me this now? The election is in 3 days. Because there's one more thing you need to know. Howard leaned forward, his voice barely audible. Reynolds' house extension plans, the ones pending final approval, they're not just for a bigger driveway or a solarium. They include the infrastructure for the eventual gate installation at the neighborhood entrance. If those plans are approved, they've cleared the biggest hurdle in their entire project. I stared at him, the implications sinking in. And as HOA president, I would have the final say on approving those plans. Now you understand why this election matters so much to them, Howard said grimly, and why they'll do anything to win. My phone rang, Marjorie's emergency call right on schedule. I gave Howard an apologetic look as I answered. Everything okay in there? Marjorie asked without preamble. Yes, but I need to wrap up. See you soon. I hung up and turned back to Howard. Can I take these documents? He nodded. I have copies securely stored elsewhere. Just be careful, Eleanor. These people have a lot to lose if their plan falls apart. As I stood to leave, Howard caught my arm. One more thing. Martha doesn't know I'm here. As far as she's concerned, I'm still in Arizona looking at condos. I'll be on a flight back this afternoon. It's safer that way. I nodded, tucking the envelope securely into my bag. Thank you, Howard, for everything. Outside, Marjorie was waiting anxiously. Well, was it really him? What did he want? It was him, I confirmed. And we have a much bigger problem than just my garden or an HOA election. As we walked back toward our neighborhood, I filled her in on everything Howard had revealed. By the time I finished, her face had gone pale. So this whole time, while we've been worrying about fines for bird feeders and garden violations, they've been plotting to essentially steal the entire neighborhood out from under us? Not steal, I corrected. Legally acquire through deliberately manipulative tactics. Marjorie shook her head in disbelief. What are you going to do with this information? Go public? I thought carefully. Not yet. If we just make accusations without proper context, Reynolds will spin it as a desperate campaign tactic. We need to be strategic. By the time we reached my house, I had the beginnings of a plan forming. First, we need to verify everything in these documents. Sophia Chen might be able to help research the property records and shell companies. Then what? The election is in 3 days, Eleanor. That's not much time to mount a comprehensive response to something this complex. We don't need to explain every detail, I said, unlocking my front door. We just need to make people understand what's really at stake. Marjorie looked skeptical. And you think we can do that in 3 days? Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Sophia Chen. Reynolds just announced emergency HOA meeting tonight, 7 p.m. Something about urgent security concerns in the neighborhood. Mandatory attendance for all candidates. I showed Marjorie the message, a sinking feeling in my stomach. He's making his move. What do you think he's planning? I don't know, but I'm guessing it's not good for us. I took a deep breath. Call everyone from our campaign committee. Emergency meeting at my house in 1 hour. And see if you can get Sophia here early. We need her legal expertise now more than ever. By 11 a.m., my living room was once again filled with concerned neighbors. Sophia Chen arrived first, immediately taking possession of Howard's documents and reviewing them with the focused intensity of someone used to examining complex legal materials. These appear legitimate, she confirmed after 20 minutes. The shell companies are real. The property transfers are properly recorded. It's all legal, but clearly designed to conceal the common ownership. And the master plan for redevelopment? I asked. Technically just a proposal at this stage, she said carefully. But the infrastructure elements hidden in Reynolds' pending. House extension? Those are very real and very concerning. The rest of the campaign committee arrived in waves. The Patels, the Garcias, Mrs. Jenkins, Mr. Abernathy, and several others who had thrown their support behind me. I explained the situation as succinctly as possible, watching their expressions shift from confusion to disbelief to outrage. So tonight's emergency meeting, Mr. Garcia said when I had finished. What do you think that's about? I think Reynolds realized Howard was back in town, I replied. He's accelerating his timeline. My guess is he'll try to push through final approval on his house extension before the election when he still controls the board. Can he do that? Mrs. Patel asked. Don't these things require notice periods? Normally, yes, Sophia interjected. But the HOA bylaws include an exception for urgent safety and security matters. If he frames the infrastructure work as a security improvement, like preparatory work for a future security gate, he might be able to circumvent the normal approval process. So what do we do? Mr. Abernathy asked, leaning heavily on his cane. If they've stacked the board, how do we stop them? I looked around at the worried faces of my neighbors, people who had built lives here, raised families, created a community that was now under threat from forces they hadn't even known existed until today. We can't stop tonight's meeting, I said slowly, but we can make sure everyone understands what's really happening. Not just the people in this room, but everyone in the neighborhood. A lot of homeowners don't even attend HOA meetings, Mrs. Jenkins pointed out. They find them boring or intimidating. They'll attend this one, I said with newfound determination. Because we're going to make sure they understand that this isn't about paint colors or lawn maintenance. It's about whether they'll be able to afford to keep their homes a year from now. For the next several hours, we developed our strategy. Sophia analyzed the legal vulnerabilities in Reynolds' plan. The Garcias and Patels coordinated door-to-door outreach to ensure maximum attendance at the evening meeting. Mrs. Jenkins, who had a background in public relations before retirement, helped me craft messaging that would be clear and compelling, even to neighbors who hadn't been following HOA politics closely. By late afternoon, we had mobilized a remarkable grassroots response. Text messages and emails were circulating through the neighborhood. People who had never attended an HOA meeting in their lives were promising to be there. The community center, where the meeting would be held, had a capacity of 150, and we expected standing room only. At 6:30 p.m., I arrived at the community center with my team. As predicted, the parking lot was already filling up, and groups of neighbors stood outside in animated conversation. Inside, the room had been set up with the board members' table at the front, facing rows of chairs that were rapidly filling with residents. Daniel Reynolds was already there, huddled with Peter, Miller, and the other board members. When he saw me enter, his expression flickered briefly with surprise before settling back into his practiced confidence. He approached, extending his hand as if we were old friends. Eleanor, quite the turnout tonight. You're doing, I presume. I shook his hand firmly. People care about their neighborhood, Daniel, especially when they realize it might be at risk. Something hardened in his eyes. Interesting choice of words. Risk is precisely what tonight's meeting is about. I'm sure it is, I replied evenly. Before he could respond, the room had filled completely. People were standing along the walls and crowding the back of the room. I estimated at least 200 residents had shown up, possibly the largest HOA meeting in our neighborhood's history. Daniel took his place at the center of the board table and called the meeting to order. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, he began smoothly. We've called this emergency session to address urgent security concerns that have recently come to the board's attention. He gestured to Peter Miller, who stood and began a polished presentation complete with crime statistics and security incident reports, most from neighborhoods miles away from ours. As you can see, Miller concluded after 10 minutes of increasingly alarming but largely irrelevant data, the threat to our community is real and growing, which is why the board has determined that preliminary infrastructure work for enhanced neighborhood security measures can no longer wait for the normal approval cycle. Daniel nodded gravely and picked up where Miller left off. The plans, which have already received preliminary approval, include necessary groundwork for future security installations as part of my property's extension project. Since my property borders the neighborhood entrance, it's the logical location for eventual gate control infrastructure. A murmur ran through the crowd. Most people looked confused. This was clearly the first they were hearing about any gate plans. "We're not voting on a full security gate installation tonight," Daniel clarified quickly, sensing the confusion. "Simply authorizing the infrastructure groundwork as part of an already approved project. This approach saves the association considerable expense by incorporating the work into a private renovation." He made it sound so reasonable, so beneficial to everyone. I could see heads nodding throughout the room. He was good, very good, at making self-interest sound like community service. "Are there questions before we move to a vote?" Daniel asked, clearly hoping to move quickly. This was the moment we had prepared for. As planned, Sophia Chen stood first. "I have reviewed the extension plans in question," she began in her clear, authoritative voice. "Nowhere in the publicly available documents is there any mention of security infrastructure. When exactly was this element added to the plans, and why wasn't it disclosed to the community?" Daniel's smile tightened slightly. "The security elements were always part of the comprehensive planning, just not explicitly detailed in the public-facing documents for security reasons. The Architectural Review Committee was fully briefed." "The same committee where 3 out of 5 members are business associates of yours in other ventures?" Sophia pressed. A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Ms. Chen, but—" "I'm not implying anything," she interrupted coolly. "I'm stating a fact. You, Peter Miller, and James Wilson served together on the board of Oakwood Ventures, a development company that has been systematically purchasing properties in this neighborhood through shell companies for the past 5 years. The room erupted in shocked conversations. Daniel banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. "These accusations are completely inappropriate for this forum," he shouted over the noise. "We're here to discuss security infrastructure, not make unfounded allegations about board members' private business activities." As the room gradually quieted, I stood up. All eyes turned toward me, including Daniel's, now blazing with barely controlled fury. "With respect, Mr. Reynolds," I said calmly, "I believe these matters are directly relevant to the vote being proposed. Before this community authorizes infrastructure for a security gate we never asked for, we deserve to know the full context of the decision we're being asked to make." I turned to address the room. "Many of you know me as the woman whose garden was recently destroyed because of a property line dispute with Mr. Reynolds. What you may not know is that this isn't just about my garden, or even about one house extension." I nodded to Mr. Garcia, who distributed copies of the Oakwood Estates brochure to people throughout the room. "This is the real plan," I continued as people began examining the glossy renderings with growing alarm. "A complete transformation of our neighborhood into a gated luxury community. Those of us who can't afford the inevitable special assessments and mandatory upgrades will be forced to sell, likely to the very people who created those financial pressures in the first place." Daniel was on his feet now, face flushed with anger. "This is outrageous. These are private business documents being presented completely out of context. This meeting is about an urgent security measure, not some hypothetical future development." "Is it hypothetical?" I challenged, holding up a copy of the property ownership records. "Because it seems very real when we look at how many homes in this neighborhood are already owned by companies affiliated with Oakwood Ventures, companies that you and other board members control." The room had gone completely silent, all eyes moving between Daniel and me like spectators at a tennis match. "The urgent infrastructure vote tonight isn't about security," I continued, my voice steady. "It's about laying the groundwork, literally, for a plan that would eventually price most of us out of our own homes. A plan that has been deliberately concealed from this community while being marketed to investors." Daniel's expression had transformed completely. Gone was the charming, reasonable neighbor. In his place stood a man whose careful plans were unraveling before his eyes. "You have no proof of any of this," he snarled. "This is nothing but a desperate campaign stunt 3 days before an election." "I have the documents right here," I replied. holding them up. Property records, corporate filings, marketing materials, all available for anyone who wants to examine them after the meeting. I turned back to the stunned residents. I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I'm asking you to look at the evidence and decide for yourselves what kind of neighborhood you want to live in. One where decisions are made transparently, with genuine community input. Or one where a small group of investors can reshape everyone's future without their knowledge or consent. The silence that followed was electric. Daniel Reynolds stood frozen at the board table, his carefully constructed facade crumbling as he faced a room full of neighbors who now saw him not as a community leader, but as someone who had been plotting against their interests while smiling to their faces. The HOA election was still 3 days away. But in that moment, watching the shift in the room, I knew something fundamental had changed. The real question now wasn't whether I would win the presidency. It was whether there would be anything left of Reynolds's plan to dismantle when I did. The community center erupted into chaos after my revelation. Neighbors who had lived side by side for years without more than a passing greeting were suddenly united in their outrage, demanding answers from a visibly shaken board. "Order, we will have order," Daniel shouted, banging his gavel uselessly as small groups formed throughout the room, examining the documents we'd distributed. Peter Miller leaned over and whispered something in Daniel's ear. Whatever he said made Daniel's face darken further. He abruptly stood up, his chair scraping loudly across the floor. "This meeting is adjourned until proper order can be restored," he announced, his voice strained with barely contained fury. "The vote on the infrastructure approval is postponed, pending legal review of these allegations." As Daniel and the other board members hurriedly gathered their papers and moved toward the exit, residents blocked their path, voices raised in angry questions. The Montoya family, whose request to install solar panels had been denied 3 times, confronted Peter Miller directly. "You said our panels would disrupt the neighborhood aesthetic," Mr. Montoya shouted, waving the Oakwood Estates brochure in Miller's face. "But these plans show every house with solar installations." "It was never about aesthetics. You just didn't want us to have equity in our home when you forced us out." Miller pushed past without responding, his face ashen. Similar confrontations were happening all around the room as the community finally understood the magnitude of what had been planned without their knowledge. Sophia Chen appeared at my side, her expression grave. "You need to get home," she said quietly. "Reynolds won't let this go unanswered. He's going to strike back, and hard." I nodded, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was fading, leaving me acutely aware of just how powerful the forces arrayed against me truly were. "I'll walk you home," Mr. Garcia insisted, his teenage sons flanking him protectively. "After what just happened, you shouldn't be alone." I gratefully accepted their escort, though part of me wondered if it was necessary. Surely Daniel wouldn't do anything overtly threatening, not with the entire neighborhood now watching his every move. As we approached my house, I noticed something odd. A municipal vehicle parked out front, its yellow lights still flashing. A city worker in a reflective vest was examining my restored garden, taking photos and making notes on a tablet. "Excuse me," I called out, hurrying forward. "What's going on here?" The worker looked up, startled. "Mrs. Bennett? I'm from the city's Code Enforcement Division. We received an urgent complaint about unpermitted landscaping encroaching on city utility easements." I stared at him in disbelief. "I've had this garden for 20 years. There's never been an issue before." He shrugged apologetically. "I'm just doing my job, ma'am. The complaint came in less than an hour ago with documentation of potential violations. I'm required to investigate and document." I didn't need to ask who had filed the complaint. The timing made it perfectly clear. While I had been exposing Daniel's scheme at the community center, he had already set retribution in motion. "This is harassment," Mr. Garcia said angrily. "She just publicly exposed corruption in the HOA, and suddenly there's an urgent code violation on her property." The worker shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I don't know anything about HOA disputes. All I know is that my supervisor sent me out here to document potential violations. And what exactly are these alleged violations? I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. According to the complaint, your irrigation system may be extending into the city's utility easement along the property line, and some of your plantings could be obstructing access to underground utilities. He gestured to the recently restored area where Daniel's excavator had done its damage. The complaint included detailed diagrams of utility line placements. Of course it did. Daniel had likely requested those diagrams when planning his property line dispute with me. Now he was using them as another weapon. My son is a civil engineer, Mr. Garcia said. He can verify whether there's any actual interference with utilities. Can you wait to file your report until we've had a chance to properly respond to these allegations? The worker hesitated. I need to submit initial documentation tonight, but I can note that the homeowner disputes the complaint and is bringing in professional assessment. That would at least slow down any enforcement action. I thanked him, and after taking a few more photos, he departed with a promise to email me copies of the complaint. The moment his vehicle pulled away, my phone rang. It was Marjorie. "Eleanor, are you home? Is everything okay?" Her voice was tense with worry. "I'm fine," I assured her. "Just dealing with Daniel's first countermove, a city code complaint about my garden." She exhaled sharply. That was fast. But it's not the only thing happening. Reynolds has called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. Closed session, board members only. Sophia thinks they're going to try to push through some kind of emergency measure before the election. Can they do that without notice? To residents. Technically, the board can hold emergency executive sessions with minimal notice for certain matters, she explained. We're working on finding out exactly what they're planning, but it's not good. After we hung up, I thanked the Garcias for their support and went inside, locking the door behind me. The house felt unusually quiet after the tumult of the day. I moved through the familiar rooms, turning on lights against the gathering darkness, trying to process everything that had happened. My phone buzzed again with a text from Sophia. Just heard from a source on the board. Tomorrow's emergency meeting is to discuss legal action against defamatory statements made at a public meeting. They're planning to sue you, Eleanor. I sank into my reading chair, Robert's favorite spot by the window, and closed my eyes. The threat of a lawsuit was intimidating, especially for someone on a fixed retirement income. Legal fees alone could be devastating, even if their claims were ultimately baseless. Was this what Howard Prescott had faced? This crushing pressure designed to silence opposition through financial threat rather than merit of argument? No wonder. He had chosen to walk away, but I wasn't Howard Prescott. And I had something he hadn't, an awakened community standing behind me. I reached for my phone and began typing a group message to our core campaign team. Emergency meeting at my house, 7 a.m. tomorrow. Reynolds planning lawsuit. Need to prepare. Countermove before their board meeting at 9. The responses came in quickly. Everyone would be there. In the meantime, I had research to do. I pulled out Howard's documents again and began combing through them more carefully, looking for anything we might have missed. 3 hours later, my dining room table was covered with papers, and I had filled several pages of a notebook with observations. There was something about the property acquisition pattern that nagged at me. It wasn't random. The Oakwood Group had targeted specific properties in a sequence that initially seemed puzzling. Why buy the Johnson property 2 years ago when the much more valuable Peterson house next door came on the market just 3 months later? Why focus so heavily on properties along Maple Street when the most expensive homes in the neighborhood were on Oak Lane? I grabbed a neighborhood map and started marking the purchased properties with red dots. Slowly, a pattern emerged, one that had nothing to do with property values and everything to do with utility access. The Oakwood Group had been systematically purchasing properties with direct access to main water, sewer, and electrical junctions, the critical infrastructure that would need to be modified for their redevelopment plans. I was still pondering the implications when my doorbell rang. It was nearly midnight, far too late for a casual visitor. Cautiously, I approached the door and peered through the peephole. Daniel Reynolds stood on my porch, alone, his expression unreadable in the dim light. I hesitated, then called through the door without opening it. "It's midnight, Daniel. Whatever this is, it can wait until morning." "5 minutes, Eleanor," he replied, his voice lacking its usual polish. "That's all I'm asking. 5 minutes of your time." Against my better judgment, I opened the door slightly, keeping the chain engaged. 5 minutes. Say what you came to say." He looked exhausted. The carefully maintained facade of the successful developer cracked to reveal something more human underneath. "May I come in? This isn't a conversation I want to have on your doorstep." "No," I said firmly. "You've already shown how little you respect my property. You don't get to enter my home." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Fair enough. I'll be direct then. You need to retract your statements from tonight's meeting and publicly withdraw from the election." I almost laughed. "Or what? You'll sue me? I already know about tomorrow's emergency board meeting. It's not just about a lawsuit, Eleanor. Think about what you're doing. These development plans represent millions in investment. Dozens of stakeholders are involved, many of them far more powerful than me. I'm just the local face." "Are you threatening me?" He looked genuinely pained. "I'm trying to protect you. You have no idea the forces you're messing with. These investors don't see a grandmother with a garden. They see an obstacle to profit that needs to be removed." "And you? What do you see, Daniel?" He hesitated. "I see someone who doesn't understand the realities of modern real estate development. This neighborhood was going to change with or without me. At least my group's plan is coherent, with quality standards. The alternative is piecemeal development that destroys community character anyway, just more slowly and chaotically. That's a convenient justification for forcing people out of their homes." "No one was going to be forced out," he insisted. "We had plans for transition assistance, relocation packages for original homeowners. That weren't mentioned in any of the documents Howard found," I interrupted. "Strange oversight for such a compassionate plan." Daniel's expression hardened. "Howard Prescott had no right to share confidential business plans. The documents you have were preliminary, incomplete, and yet complete enough to be marketing to investors." He checked his watch. "Your 5 minutes are almost up, so let me be absolutely clear. If you continue down this path, the consequences won't just be legal. Think about your garden, Eleanor. That was just a property line dispute. Imagine if every aspect of your life received the same level of scrutiny. Your home insurance, your tax returns, your pension compliance." My hand tightened on the door. "Now you are threatening me." "I'm describing reality," he corrected coolly. "Power doesn't just disappear because you exposed one plan. It regroups, adapts, and strikes from different angles. You won the battle tonight, but ask yourself, can you really win the war?" With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me staring after him in the darkness. I barely slept that night, Daniel's words echoing in my mind. Was he right? Was I naive to think that exposing their plan would be enough? These were wealthy, connected people with significant resources and motivation to protect their investment. What chance did a retired librarian and a loose coalition of concerned neighbors really have against such forces? By 6:30 the next morning, I had made coffee and set out the documents for review. The first to arrive was Sophia, already dressed for court in a sharp suit, her expression grimly determined. "I've been up all night researching precedents," she announced without preamble. "If they sue for defamation, they'll need to prove what you said was false. Everything you presented was documented fact. It's an intimidation tactic, nothing more." One by one, the others arrived. Marjorie, the Garcias, the Patels, Mrs. Jenkins, Mr. Abernathy, and several more neighbors who had joined our coalition after last night's revelations. Despite the early hour, there was an energy in the room, a collective determination that hadn't been there before. I shared my midnight conversation with Daniel and my discovery about the strategic pattern of property acquisitions. Sophia nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense. Infrastructure access is critical for large-scale redevelopment. Without controlling those junction properties, they'd need city approvals for major utility work, which would trigger public hearings, and environmental reviews. So, by buying properties with existing access rights, they could modify the infrastructure incrementally, staying under the threshold for major review, Mr. Garcia concluded, the engineer in him appreciating the strategy, even as the neighbor in him was appalled by it. Exactly, I confirmed. And look at the timing of the purchases. Always just before an adjacent property would be expected to need significant maintenance. They've been creating pressure points to force sales. Mrs. Patel leaned forward. So what do we do? They're bored. Meeting is in 2 hours. Sophia had been tapping rapidly on her tablet throughout our discussion. She looked up, a hint of triumph in her eyes. I think I found something. 3 of the shell companies they used for purchases failed to properly register as foreign LLCs doing business in the state. It's a technical violation, but it means those properties are held in a legally questionable status. How does that help us? Marjorie asked. It means, Sophia explained, that those 3 board members, including Daniel Reynolds, may not legally qualify as property owners in good standing under the HOA bylaws. If they're not valid property owners, they can't serve on the board. A ripple of excitement moved through the room. Could we challenge their board status before the emergency meeting? I asked. Sophia checked her watch. If I file the challenge electronically right now, with supporting documentation, they would at minimum need to address the challenge before conducting any official business. It would disrupt today's meeting and buy us time. Do it, I decided. And while you're handling the legal side, the rest of us need to continue mobilizing the neighborhood. The election is still 2 days away, and we can't assume this challenge will stick. We spent the next hour dividing responsibilities. The Garcias and Patels would coordinate door-to-door outreach to ensure every resident understood what was at stake. Mrs. Jenkins would organize a communications team to counter any misinformation the Reynolds group might spread. Mr. Abernathy, who knew several local reporters, would reach out to media contacts about covering the story of predatory development tactics in established neighborhoods. By 8:30 a.m., everyone had departed with clear assignments. Everyone except Marjorie, who lingered behind. You didn't give yourself a task, she observed quietly. I smiled tiredly. I did, actually. The most important one. Which is? Getting my garden ready for inspection, I replied. Daniel's code enforcement complaint may be tactical, but if there's even a grain of truth to it, I need to address it. I won't give them any legitimate ammunition. Marjorie's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and her eyes widened. It worked! Sophia's challenge was accepted for review. The board meeting has been postponed pending determination of member eligibility. I felt a surge of relief, quickly tempered by realism. That buys us time, but it's just one battle. Daniel was right about one thing. They have resources and connections we can't match. They'll find another angle of attack. Maybe, Marjorie acknowledged, but they're fighting alone, while we have the entire neighborhood behind us now. As if to underscore her point, my phone began lighting up with messages from neighbors. The Johnsons are back from Florida and want to help with the campaign. Mrs. Peterson is offering her front yard for a campaign rally tomorrow. The high school debate team wants to help distribute informational flyers about the Oakwood plan. Each message represented another thread in a rapidly strengthening community fabric, the very thing Daniel and his investors had failed to account for in their calculations. Later that morning, as I worked in my garden carefully marking utility, access points to ensure compliance, A shadow fell across the flower bed. I looked up to find Mrs. Prescott standing there, a manila envelope in her hands. "Howard called me last night," she said without preamble. "Told me everything. He also said, I should give you these if things escalated." She handed me the envelope. "It's the original draft of the Oakwood agreement with investor signatures, the one they didn't want found." I opened it carefully and scanned the documents inside. Unlike the marketing materials and property records Howard had provided, these were internal planning documents with explicit strategies for forcing out holdout residents, including targeted HOA violations, manipulated assessment schedules, and coordinated pressure from city inspectors. My hands trembled as I recognized Daniel's signature on the strategy document, along with those of other board members and several names I didn't recognize. "This is damning," I said softly. "Howard thought so too. It's why they came after him so hard." She straightened her shoulders. "I'm tired of being afraid of these people. Use it however you need to." After she left, I called Sophia immediately and described what I'd received. "This changes everything," she said, her voice tense with excitement. "This isn't just aggressive business tactics anymore. This is conspiracy to deprive people of property rights. I need to see those documents right away." By that afternoon, copies of the Oakwood agreement had been delivered to the city attorney's office, the county prosecutor, and 3 local news outlets. By evening, the story had broken wide open, not just in our neighborhood, but across the city. "Predatory development scheme exposed in Oakdale Heights," read the headline on the local news website. Below, it was a picture of me standing in what remained of my garden, along with details of the investigation now being launched into the Oakwood Group's activities. My phone rang constantly, reporters seeking comments, neighbors offering support, even the mayor's office requesting a meeting to discuss community preservation strategies. In the midst of the chaos, a text message came through from an unknown number. "You've made some powerful enemies today. Hope it was worth it. This isn't over." I didn't need to ask who it was from. Instead of responding, I sent a copy to Sophia to add to the growing evidence of intimidation. The next morning, one day before the election, I awoke to find my front yard filled with neighbors. Not just my campaign supporters, but dozens of residents from across the neighborhood, many of whom I barely knew. They carried garden tools, plants, and building materials. Marjorie approached as I stepped onto my porch, bewildered. "What is all this?" "After the news broke last night, people wanted to do something tangible," she explained. "Someone suggested finishing the restoration of your garden as a symbol of community resilience. It just snowballed from there." Throughout the day, neighbors worked side by side, rebuilding not just my garden, but something more intangible. Children planted flower bulbs alongside grandparents. Teenagers helped elderly residents carry mulch and soil. People who had lived as strangers despite sharing a neighborhood for years introduced themselves, shared stories, and exchanged phone numbers. By sunset, my garden had been not just restored, but transformed. Where Daniel's excavator had carved destruction, there now stood a beautiful community space with a small bench and a plaque that read simply, "Roots Matter." As darkness fell and the last volunteers departed, Sophia arrived with news. The board members have withdrawn their legal challenge. All 3 of the members with questionable property holdings have resigned, effective immediately. The remaining board members have issued a statement distancing themselves from the Oakwood plan. "And Daniel?" I asked. "Gone," she said. "Packed. Up and left this afternoon, according to his neighbors. The city attorney wants to speak with him, but it appears he's trying to outrun the scandal." I should have felt triumph, but instead felt a curious hollowness. "It seems almost too easy, after everything." Sophia shook her head. "Don't mistake a retreat for surrender. Men like Reynolds don't just disappear. He'll resurface somewhere else, with another plan. But for now at least, this neighborhood is safe." Election day arrived with a sense of anticlimactic certainty. With 3 board members resigned and their development scheme exposed, there was no organized opposition to my candidacy. By evening, the results were official. I had been elected HOA president with 87% of the votes, the highest margin in neighborhood history. At the small celebration gathering in my backyard, surrounded by neighbors who had become friends and allies, I finally felt the weight of the past weeks lifting. The garden around us, destroyed and reborn, seemed a fitting metaphor for the neighborhood itself. Damaged but resilient, with deeper roots than anyone had realized. Mrs. Jenkins raised her, glass and a toast, to Eleanor, who saved not just her garden, but all our homes. I shook my head, looking around at the faces of those who had stood with me. I didn't do it alone. We all did this, together. As the party wound down and guests departed, I found myself sitting alone on the new bench in what we now called the community corner of my garden. The evening air carried the scent of freshly turned soil and new plantings, the promise of growth to come. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Congratulations on your victory. Enjoy it while it lasts." I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Daniel Reynolds might not be done with his ambitions, but neither was I done with mine. He had destroyed my garden, thinking he was eliminating an obstacle to his plans. Instead, he had planted the seeds of his own defeat and my transformation. In trying to reshape our neighborhood through power and money, he had failed to understand its true strength, not in property values or architectural uniformity, but in the human connections that bound it together. Those were roots too deep for any excavator to destroy. I tucked my phone away and gazed up at the stars appearing in the twilight sky. Whatever challenges might come next, we would face them as we had faced this one, not as isolated individuals, but as a community with shared purpose and newfound strength. Daniel had destroyed my garden, but in doing so, he had helped us rediscover something far more valuable: the power of standing together to protect the place we all called home. 6 months into my presidency, I was beginning to understand why Howard Prescott had looked so tired at our clandestine meeting. Running an HOA wasn't just about enforcing rules or managing a budget. It was about navigating the complex social ecosystem of a neighborhood where everyone's most significant investment was at stake. The Oakwood scandal had receded from daily headlines, but its effects lingered. The city attorney's investigation had expanded to include several other neighborhoods where similar predatory practices had been identified. 3 of the investors behind the scheme faced charges for conspiracy and fraud, though Daniel Reynolds himself remained conspicuously absent from legal proceedings. According to rumors, he had relocated overseas, Switzerland or perhaps the Cayman Islands, beyond the immediate reach of local authorities. The vacancies on our board had been filled through special elections, bringing in fresh perspectives that more accurately reflected our community's diversity. Mr. Patel now headed the Architectural Review Committee, Mrs. Garcia managed community events, and Sophia Chen had taken on the role of legal counsel. Together, we had begun the painstaking process of unwinding the damage done by the previous administration. "These fee structures make no sense," I muttered one evening, poring over financial records in my dining room with Sophia and our newly appointed treasurer, Mr. Abernathy. "Why were seniors paying higher rates for fewer services?" Mr. Abernathy adjusted his glasses, frowning at the spreadsheet. "It looks like they created a tiered system based on property value rather than household size or usage. The older homes, despite being smaller and using fewer resources, were assessed at a higher percentage rate." "Another pressure tactic," Sophia observed, making notes, "forced the fixed-income residents to subsidize services primarily benefiting newer, wealthier homeowners. Over time, it becomes unsustainable." We had discovered dozens of such mechanisms buried in HOA policies, seemingly neutral rules that, in practice, created gradual but inexorable pressure on original homeowners. Each time we identified and rectified one, I felt a small measure of victory, like pulling weeds from a recovering garden. The garden itself had become something of a neighborhood symbol. What had begun as a gesture of solidarity, neighbors helping, restore what Daniel had destroyed, had evolved into a community space. The community corner with its bench had expanded into a small gathering area where people would stop to chat, share garden cuttings, or simply enjoy a moment of tranquility. On to you. This particular spring morning, I was deadheading spent blooms when a car I didn't recognize pulled up across the street. A woman stepped out, professionally dressed, carrying a leather portfolio, and approached my garden gate. "Mrs. Bennett?" she called. "Eleanor Bennett?" I straightened, brushing soil from my gardening gloves. "Yes, that's me." She smiled, extending her hand. "Vanessa Kingsley from Meridian Properties. Do you have a moment to talk?" The name rang a bell. Meridian was one of the largest real estate development firms in the region, known for high-end commercial projects and luxury residential communities. My guard immediately went up. "What can I do for you, Ms. Kingsley?" "Please, call me Vanessa." Her smile remained perfectly in place as she glanced admiringly around my garden. "What a lovely space you've created here. I understand it has quite a story behind it." "It does," I acknowledged cautiously. "Though I'm not sure what that has to do with Meridian Properties." She opened her portfolio, revealing glossy architectural renderings. "I'll be direct, Mrs. Bennett. Meridian has acquired the remaining Oakwood holdings in your neighborhood. All 18 properties previously held by their shell companies." My heart sank. Was it beginning again so soon? "And you're here to tell me about your plans to continue where they left off?" Vanessa's smile faltered slightly. "Actually, quite the opposite. The Oakwood debacle was a PR nightmare for the development community. Meridian acquired their assets at a significant discount, specifically to implement a different approach." She handed me a bound proposal document. "We'd like to work with your HOA to develop these properties individually, respecting the existing neighborhood character and involving the community in the process." I leafed through the proposal skeptically. The renderings showed modestly sized homes that, while clearly upscale, weren't the towering mansions Oakwood had envisioned. There were green spaces, community gardens, and even affordable units designated for seniors. "This looks different," I admitted. "But why come to me directly instead of submitting to the Architectural Review Committee?" Vanessa's professional demeanor softened slightly. "Because we know what happened here. We know the community trusts you, and frankly, we need that trust. Development doesn't have to be adversarial, Mrs. Bennett. The best projects happen when developers and communities work together." I closed the proposal, neither accepting nor rejecting it. "I'll need to review this with our board and get community input." "Of course," she nodded, handing me her card. "We're in no rush. Quality relationships take time to build, much like gardens." After she left, I sat on my garden bench, turning her card over in my hands. Was this a genuine olive branch or simply a more sophisticated version of the same predatory approach? The cynical part of me, the part that had watched Daniel Reynolds destroy my garden without remorse, suspected the latter. But the part of me that had witnessed our neighborhood come together in crisis wanted to believe better outcomes were possible. I called an informal board meeting that evening at my house. As we gathered around my dining room table, I shared the Meridian proposal and Vanessa's unexpected visit. "It could be legitimate," Sophia acknowledged after reviewing the documents. "Meridian does have a better reputation than most developers. They've won awards for community engagement." "Or it could be the same wolf in a more expensive sheep's costume," Mrs. Garcia countered. "Coming directly to you instead of following procedures already seems manipulative." Mr. Patel examined the architectural renderings with a professional eye. "These designs are actually quite sensitive to the neighborhood context, not like the Oakwood monstrosities at all." "What if," Marjorie suggested carefully, "we use this as an opportunity? Test whether they're sincere by setting terms they wouldn't accept if they're just out to maximize profit. A thoughtful silence fell over the group. Like what? I asked. Affordable housing requirements. Green building standards beyond code minimum. Community space requirements. Long-term anti-flipping provisions. Sophia listed, warming to the idea. If they're genuinely interested in responsible development, these shouldn't be deal breakers. And if they balk, we'll know it's just Oakwood with better PR, Mr. Abernathy concluded. For the next 2 weeks, we worked on crafting a community response to Meridian's proposal. Rather than simply accepting or rejecting it, we developed a detailed counter-proposal that incorporated many of their ideas, but added significant community benefit requirements and safeguards against speculation. We also organized a neighborhood forum where residents could review both proposals and provide feedback. The meeting drew our largest turnout yet, even larger than during the height of the Oakwood scandal. People who had never engaged with neighborhood governance before offered thoughtful input on everything from architectural styles to traffic patterns to landscaping preferences. By the end of the evening, we had compiled pages of community feedback and a clear mandate. Proceed cautiously with Meridian, but only with ironclad community protections in place. I called Vanessa the next morning and invited her to a formal presentation of our counter-proposal. 3 days later, she arrived at the community center with 2 colleagues, an architect and a community engagement specialist. The room was packed with interested neighbors, many still wary after the Oakwood experience, but curious about this new direction. Thank you for the opportunity to address your community, Vanessa began once everyone had settled. Before we discuss your counter-proposal, I'd like to introduce someone. She gestured toward the door, where an elderly gentleman in a well-tailored suit had just entered. He walked slowly to the front of the room, leaning slightly on a cane. This is Edmund Meridian, founder and chairman of Meridian Properties, Vanessa announced. He specifically requested to be here today. A murmur ran through the crowd. Edmund Meridian was something of a local legend, a developer who had started with nothing in the 1960s and built an empire, known both for shrewd business acumen and occasionally unorthodox community-focused initiatives. Good afternoon, he began, his voice surprisingly strong for his apparent age. I don't make many public appearances these days, but this project is personal for me. He paused, surveying the room. You see, I grew up in this neighborhood, long before it was called Oakdale Heights. My parents owned a small home on Maple Street from 1947 until 1972. Another ripple of surprise moved through the audience. When I heard about what Oakwood Ventures attempted to do here, it struck a particular nerve. Development should enhance communities, not destroy them. His gaze found mine. Mrs. Bennett, I understand you recently took on the challenging role of HOA president after standing up to protect this neighborhood. I respect that enormously. He turned back to address the full room. I've reviewed your counter-proposal. It's thoughtful, comprehensive, and frankly, quite demanding. A smile creased his weathered face. I wouldn't expect less from a community that successfully outmaneuvered Daniel Reynolds. I'm pleased to say that Meridian accepts your terms, with only minor technical adjustments suggested by our legal team. The room erupted in surprised conversation. I exchanged glances with Sophia, who looked as stunned as I felt. This was not how development negotiations typically proceeded. Edmund raised his hand for quiet. There's one additional element I'd like to propose. Not as a condition, but as a gesture of goodwill. Meridian would like to establish a community grant program, funded by a percentage of our project profits, to support neighborhood improvements directed by residents themselves. After the meeting concluded, Edmund Meridian approached me personally. Mrs. Bennett, might I impose on you for a brief tour of the neighborhood? It's been many years since I walked these streets, and I'd value your perspective as current HOA president. Despite my lingering caution, I agreed. As we walked slowly through the neighborhood, he pointed out houses he remembered from childhood and asked thoughtful questions about current residents and community needs. When we reached my home and garden, he paused, taking in the now flourishing space that had been partially destroyed less than a year ago. "Your garden has quite a reputation," he said. "The catalyst for a community revolution, I'm told." I smiled, running my hand along the trellis where my recovered wisteria was beginning to climb again. "Not by design. I just wanted to protect something I loved. The best revolutions often start that way." He nodded toward the community corner, where several neighbors had gathered on the bench, watching us curiously. "You've created something remarkable here. Not just plants and flowers, but a genuine community center." "It was a collective effort," I corrected gently. "After what happened with Daniel Reynolds, people realized what we stood to lose if we remained isolated from each other." Edmund was quiet for a moment, studying the garden with a thoughtful expression. "You know, in 50 years of development work, I've learned that there are two approaches to building places for people. You can impose a vision from above, designing spaces you think people should want. Or you can observe what people naturally create when given the chance, and then support and enhance those organic patterns." He gestured toward my garden. This organic community space is precisely what most developers spend millions trying and failing to create artificially." An idea began to take shape in my mind. "Mr. Meridian, regarding those properties Meridian acquired, what if instead of developing all of them as homes, one or two were repurposed as community spaces? Extensions of what's happened here, but on a larger scale?" His eyes lit up with interest. "What exactly are you envisioning, Mrs. Bennett?" Over the next hour, as we sat in my garden, a collaborative vision emerged. One of the centrally located properties could become a true community garden and gathering space, with areas for growing food, teaching children about plants, and holding neighborhood events. Another could be developed as an intergenerational, shared space, part senior center, part after-school program, part co-working facility. "This is exactly the kind of thinking that creates lasting value," Edmund said, making notes as we talked. "Not just financial value, though that will follow, but social value, community resilience." By the time he departed, we had sketched out a framework for a joint community developer project unlike anything I had imagined possible in the aftermath of the Oakwood debacle. Rather than an adversarial relationship where each side tried to extract concessions from the other, we had found common ground in a shared vision for neighborhood enhancement. The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. The Meridian Project moved forward with unprecedented levels of community involvement. Weekly design workshops allowed residents to provide input on everything from exterior finishes to landscape plans. The two community-focused properties became a neighborhood passion project, with volunteer committees forming to help plan and eventually manage the spaces. Not everything was smooth, of course. Some residents remained deeply skeptical of any developer, regardless of approach. Technical issues arose that required compromise on both sides. The city's permitting process moved at its usual glacial pace, testing everyone's patience. But through it all, the neighborhood maintained the solidarity that had emerged during the Oakwood crisis. Problems were addressed collectively, with an openness that stood in stark contrast to the secretive manipulation of the previous regime. 8 months after Vanessa Kingsley's initial visit, ground was broken on the first Meridian property, the community garden and gathering space that had grown from our initial conversation. Edmund Meridian himself attended the ceremony, joining me in turning the first ceremonial shovelful of soil, from destruction to creation. He remarked quietly as cameras flashed around us. "That's the cycle of true renewal, isn't it?" As summer turned to fall, my term as HOA president approached its halfway point. The role remained demanding, with daily challenges that tested my patience and diplomatic skills. But the rewards, watching our neighborhood transform from a collection of adjacent properties into a genuine community, made the difficulties worthwhile. One crisp October morning, as I pruned back summer growth and prepared my garden for the coming winter, a familiar car pulled up across the street. My stomach tightened as Daniel Reynolds stepped out, looking much as he had the day he destroyed my garden. Expensively dressed, confident in his bearing, that same calculating look in his eyes. He stood at the edge of my property, hands in his pockets, surveying the changes. The garden had evolved significantly since his excavator had torn through it, more lush, more diverse, and now incorporating the community space that spilled seamlessly into the public sidewalk area. I set down my pruning shears and walked to the edge of my garden, stopping a few feet from where he stood. "Daniel," I acknowledged, neither welcoming nor hostile. "Eleanor." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "I see you've been busy." "The whole neighborhood has been busy," I corrected. "A lot has changed since you left." His gaze moved past my garden to where construction was visible on the community gathering space. "So I've heard. Meridian Properties. Quite the pivot from Oakwood's vision." "A better vision," I said simply. "One that builds rather than extracts." A faint smile crossed his face. "Always the idealist. You know Edmund Meridian stands to make a substantial profit from this community-focused approach, don't you? The premium buyers will pay for homes in a genuine community far outweighs what would have been gained through Oakwood's more aggressive strategy." "The difference is that everyone benefits," I replied. "Not just the developers and investors, but every resident. Value doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, Daniel." He seemed to consider this, looking again at the construction site. "Perhaps. I underestimated you, Eleanor, and this neighborhood. That was a costly miscalculation." "Is that why you're back? To reassess your miscalculation?" Daniel shook his head. "Just tying up loose ends before heading back overseas. My attorneys advised appearing in person for certain signatures to avoid complications." "The investigation is still ongoing," I reminded him. 3 of your partners have already settled with authorities." "Yes. Well, their legal strategies were as unimaginative as their business approaches." He straightened his jacket. "I don't expect to face any significant consequences." The casual arrogance in his tone, the absolute certainty that rules and accountability were for others, not for him, reignited the anger I had thought long resolved. "You destroyed something precious to me, Daniel. Something irreplaceable. Parts of my garden that had connections to my late husband, plants that can't be regrown in my lifetime." His expression didn't change. "Business decision, nothing personal." "It was personal to me," I said evenly, "and to this community. But in the end, what you destroyed led to something stronger. So in a way, we should thank you." For the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine emotion cross his face, something like frustration or perhaps regret. "Enjoying your moment of triumph, Eleanor? It won't last forever. Development is a long game. Today's community garden is tomorrow's. Luxury condominium, it's just a matter of timing and approach." I smiled, feeling a calm certainty that would have been impossible a year ago. "You still don't understand what happened here, do you? This isn't about beating developers or stopping change. It's about a community discovering its power to shape its own future rather than having it imposed from outside." I gestured toward my thriving garden and the busy construction site beyond. "Whatever comes next, whether it's 5 years from now or 50, this neighborhood now knows how to stand together. That's a kind of root system even your excavator couldn't tear out." Daniel studied me for a long moment, then gave a short, humorless laugh. "Well, I suppose we'll see, won't we? Time has a way of testing even the strongest roots." With that, he turned and walked back to his car without another word. I watched him drive away, feeling neither victory nor fear, just a quiet certainty that whatever challenges the future might hold, They would be faced by a community rather than by isolated individuals. That evening, as neighbors gathered in the community corner of my garden for an impromptu potluck dinner, a tradition that had developed organically over recent months, I shared the news of Daniel's brief return. "Do you think he'll try again?" Mrs. Jenkins asked, voicing the concern on many minds. "Come back with another scheme?" I looked around at the faces that had become so familiar and dear to me, people who had transformed from distant neighbors into friends and allies through our shared struggle. "He might," I acknowledged, "or someone like him. The pressures of development don't disappear just because we won one battle. But we'll be ready," Mr. Garcia said firmly, raising his glass. "And this time, we won't be starting from scratch." Murmurs of agreement circled the gathering as the conversation shifted to plans for the upcoming community garden opening ceremony. As darkness fell and fireflies began to rise from the flower beds, a magical sight I hadn't witnessed in my garden for years before the restoration, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Daniel Reynolds had destroyed my garden, thinking it merely collateral damage in his pursuit of profit. Instead, he had inadvertently planted the seeds of a stronger, more vigilant community, one that had learned how to protect what it valued most. As the neighborhood children chased fireflies across the lawn and their parents laughed and shared stories under string lights, I realized that the garden blooming around us was far more than plants and soil. It was the visible manifestation of something deeper and more enduring, a community that had rediscovered its roots and was growing stronger every day. Winter settled over our neighborhood, transforming the landscape with a quiet blanket of snow. The construction sites for Meridian's projects paused briefly during the coldest weeks, their frameworks standing like dormant skeletons against the gray sky, waiting for spring to bring them to life. In my garden, only the evergreens and structural elements remained visible above the snow, the arbors and trellises, the stone pathways, and the community bench area, which neighbors had thoughtfully covered with a small pavilion to keep it usable year-round. Even in December's chill, it remained a gathering spot, now featuring thermoses of hot chocolate and impromptu carol singing on weekend evenings. As HOA president, winter brought different challenges: snow plowing disputes, holiday decoration guidelines, which we had significantly relaxed from the previous administration's draconian standards, and heating system failures in the community center all demanded attention. But there was a fundamental difference now. Problems were approached collectively, with neighbors helping neighbors rather than filing formal complaints. On a particularly frigid January morning, I arrived at the community center to find water cascading down the front steps, already freezing into a treacherous sheet of ice. A pipe had burst in the night, and the automated alert system, another remnant of the old regime that had never functioned properly, had failed to notify anyone. Immediately started making calls, expecting a long wait for emergency plumbing services during the winter surge. To my surprise, within 30 minutes, the Garcia's nephew, a licensed plumber, and Mr. Patel's brother-in-law, a contractor, had arrived with tools and materials. 3 hours later, the pipe was repaired, the water cleaned up, and volunteers were setting up industrial fans to dry the affected areas. No formal request had been made, no HOA funds allocated, no official work order processed, just neighbors responding to a community need, because they now saw the community center as truly theirs, not some abstract entity managed by distant authorities. "This never would have happened a year ago," Marjorie commented as we supervised the cleanup. "Remember when the Harper's basement flooded last winter? They waited 3 days for the HOA's approved vendor to even return their call." I nodded, remembering the rigid system we had inherited and dismantled. The old board was so focused on control that they actually made everything function worse. Speaking of the old regime, Marjorie lowered her voice. "Have you heard the latest about Peter Miller?" Peter Miller had been Daniel Reynolds' right-hand man on the architectural committee and one of the key conspirators in the Oakwood scheme. Unlike Reynolds, He hadn't fled overseas but had instead attempted to weather the scandal locally. "What now?" I asked. "He's selling his house. Quietly. Not even listed publicly yet." Sarah Chen heard it from her real estate contacts. Sophia's wife, Sarah, worked as a high-end real estate agent, giving us occasionally useful insider information about neighborhood property movements. Moving to another neighborhood, I mused, or leaving town altogether. Apparently leaving the state. The investigation into the Oakwood affair has expanded again. According to Sarah, the prosecutors are now looking into similar schemes in 3 other cities where Miller had investment properties. I wasn't surprised. From what we'd learned about the Oakwood operations, it had seemed too sophisticated to be their first attempt at neighborhood manipulation. "Good riddance," I said simply. "Though I wonder who'll buy his house." The answer came sooner than expected. The following week, Sarah Chen herself requested a meeting with the Architectural Review Committee, not in her capacity as a real estate agent, but as a prospective buyer. "You're buying Miller's house?" Mr. Patel asked when she made her presentation to the committee. I was attending as an observer, curious about this development. Sarah nodded. "It's a complex situation. After what happened with Oakwood, the property is, let's say, reputationally challenged. The bank that holds Miller's mortgage is concerned about recovering their investment if it sits vacant too long." "And you see opportunity in this challenge?" I asked. "Sophia and I have been looking to downsize now that the kids are in college," she explained. "Our current house is too large for just the 2 of us. Miller's property is smaller but well located. And yes, we can acquire it significantly below market value." She unrolled a set of architectural plans on the table. "However, we'd like to make some modifications. Given the property's history, we thought it important to be fully transparent about our intentions from the beginning." The plan showed thoughtful renovations that would actually reduce the home's ostentatious facade, replacing Miller's grandiose columns and imposing entryway with a more modest, welcoming design. The backyard, currently dominated by an oversized pool and entertainment area, would be partially converted to a productive garden space with fruit trees and vegetables. These changes would bring the property more in line with the neighborhood's original character, Sarah concluded. Less showcase, more home. After Sarah left, the committee discussed the proposal. There was something poetically fitting about the transformation. The same property that had once exemplified the aggressive, status-oriented approach of the Reynolds era would now embody the more balanced values our community had reclaimed. The renovations were unanimously approved, with Mr. Patel adding a personal note of appreciation for the thoughtful approach. As I walked home afterward, I reflected on how much had changed in a year. The Architectural Review Committee, once the primary instrument of Reynolds's control, was now a collaborative body focused on genuine community enhancement rather than property value maximization at all costs. February brought an unexpected development from the legal front. The city attorney's office contacted me directly, requesting a meeting regarding the ongoing Oakwood investigation. Accompanied by Sophia in her capacity as HOA counsel, I arrived at City Hall unsure what to expect. Assistant City Attorney Jessica Morales welcomed us into a conference room where several other officials were already waiting. Representatives from the District Attorney's Office, the State Real Estate Commission, and surprisingly, a federal agent from what appeared to be the Treasury Department. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Bennett," Morales began once introductions were complete. "Your community's experience with Oakwood Ventures has become a central element in a much larger investigation." The federal agent, who had introduced himself only as Agent Campos, opened a laptop and turned it to face us. On the screen was a complex diagram showing dozens of corporate entities connected by lines and arrows. "What you encountered as Oakwood Ventures was actually part of a sophisticated network of shell companies operating in 7 states, he explained. They've been implementing variations of the same predatory development strategy in targeted neighborhoods across the country. Sophia leaned forward, studying the diagram. The same individuals behind all of these? A core group of 5 primary operators, with various local partners in each city, Agent Campos confirmed. Daniel Reynolds was their point person in your community, but he was following a playbook developed and refined elsewhere. And you're telling us this because... I prompted. Morales exchanged glances with her colleagues before continuing. We're preparing to bring formal charges against the entire network, including Reynolds. The case is strong but complex. Testimony from affected communities will be crucial in helping a jury understand how these technical violations translated to real-world harm. You want me to testify? I said, realizing where this was heading. You specifically, Mrs. Bennett. The DA's representative confirmed. Your experience, from the garden destruction to uncovering the broader scheme, provides a compelling narrative that encapsulates the entire operation. I hesitated, remembering Daniel's parting comment about facing no significant consequences. Reynolds isn't even in the country. How would this affect him? We've located him, Agent Campos stated flatly. The wheels are in motion for his return, whether voluntary or otherwise. International financial crimes have a way of transcending jurisdictional boundaries. After the meeting, Sophia and I walked slowly back to our neighborhood, processing the implications. Are you going to do it? She asked. Testify? I considered the question carefully. The investigation had already consumed significant time and emotional energy. Participating in a high-profile case would mean more disruption, more stress, potentially even security concerns if the financial stakes were as high as the officials had implied. I need to think about it, I said finally. This isn't just my decision. It affects our whole community. That evening, I called an informal gathering at my home for the core group that had helped navigate the Oakwood crisis. Marjorie, the Garcias, the Patels, Mr. Abernathy, Mrs. Jenkins, and Sophia. I explained the request from the authorities and the expanded scope of the investigation. They're not just after Reynolds, Sophia emphasized. This is about dismantling an entire network of predatory developers. What happened here was apparently just one instance of a national pattern. All the more reason to participate, Mrs. Garcia said firmly. If we can help prevent other neighborhoods from experiencing what we did, don't we have an obligation to do so? Mr. Abernathy looked concerned. But at what cost to Eleanor? These people have resources and connections. Going up against them publicly could have consequences. I appreciate the concern, I said. But my decision can't be based on fear. I need to consider what's right, not just what's safe. We discussed the matter for hours, weighing different perspectives and considering the potential impacts, not just on me personally, but on our neighborhood's ongoing recovery and development projects. Whatever you decide, you won't face it alone, Marjorie assured me, expressing the sentiment that eventually emerged as the group consensus. This community stands together now. As the discussion wound down, Mrs. Jenkins, who had been unusually quiet throughout, finally spoke up. You know, when my husband was alive, he used to say that the true test of any community is what it does with its power once it finds it. She looked around the room at each of us. We discovered our collective power when we were under threat. Now we need to decide how to use it beyond our own boundaries. Her words stayed with me long after everyone had gone home. The next morning, I called Assistant City Attorney Morales and agreed to testify. Whatever personal discomfort or risk it might entail seemed insignificant compared to the opportunity to hold accountable those who had attempted to exploit not just our neighborhood but communities across the country. March arrived with the first hints of spring, snowdrops pushing through the melting snow in my garden, buds swelling on the maple trees, and renewed activity at the Meridian construction sites. The community garden project was progressing rapidly, with the framework of the central pavilion now clearly visible. Edmund Meridian himself continued to take a personal interest in the development, visiting the site weekly, despite his advanced age. He often stopped by my garden afterward for tea, our conversations ranging from horticultural techniques to community planning principles to personal stories of the neighborhood's earlier days. I remember when this was all farmland beyond. The third block, he told me one afternoon, gazing down the street with the distant look of someone seeing a landscape long vanished. My father used to take me fishing in the creek that ran where Maple Street is now. It's hard to imagine, I said, trying to picture the rural setting that had preceded our suburban neighborhood. Change is inevitable, he mused. The question is whether it happens with wisdom and care, or merely for profit without consideration of what's lost. He turned to me with a smile. That's why what you've done here matters so much, Eleanor. You've shown that progress and preservation aren't mutually exclusive. His words were particularly meaningful given the news I had received that morning. The federal case against the Oakwood Network was proceeding, with indictments expected within weeks. Daniel Reynolds had been located in the Cayman Islands and was negotiating terms of his return to face charges. I've been asked to testify against Daniel Reynolds and his associates, I told Edmund, curious about his reaction as someone who operated in the same industry, albeit with a different approach. His expression grew serious. Good. What they attempted, here and apparently elsewhere, crosses a line that should never be crossed in responsible development. Using predatory tactics to deliberately destabilize existing communities isn't just unethical, it's destructive to the very fabric of society. He leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. I've been in this business a long time, Eleanor. I've seen the damage done by developers who view communities as merely assets to be extracted, rather than living ecosystems to be enhanced. Standing against that matters more than you might realize. April brought a dramatic turning point in the Oakwood case. Daniel Reynolds returned to the United States voluntarily rather than face extradition. According to news reports, he had struck a deal with prosecutors, agreeing to provide evidence against higher-level operators in the scheme in exchange for leniency. The news rippled through our neighborhood, eliciting mixed reactions. Some felt vindicated that he would face consequences. Others were concerned that his cooperation might allow him to escape meaningful punishment. My own feelings were complicated. The man who had casually destroyed my garden and threatened my community would likely serve little, if any, prison time. Yet his reputation and career were in ruins, his schemes exposed, his name now synonymous with predatory development tactics in industry publications and academic case studies. Was it enough? I wasn't sure. But I also recognized that my focus had shifted from seeking justice against Daniel Reynolds to building something positive from the aftermath of his actions. This perspective was reinforced when Vanessa Kingsley from Meridian Properties invited me to tour the nearly completed community garden site. Walking through the space that had evolved from our collaborative planning sessions, I was struck by how much it embodied the spirit of resilience that had emerged from our neighborhood crisis. The central pavilion incorporated reclaimed wood from older neighborhood structures that had been carefully dismantled rather than demolished. The garden beds were arranged to accommodate gardeners of all ages and physical abilities, with some at standard height and others elevated for accessibility. A small amphitheater area provided space for community gatherings and educational events. Most touching was the memorial section, a quiet corner where residents could dedicate plantings to loved ones lost. Among the first installations was a Japanese maple dedicated to Robert, positioned to catch the morning light just as he would have wanted. We're on schedule for the grand opening next month, Vanessa informed me as we completed the tour. Edmund is particularly eager to have you speak at the ceremony, given your role in conceiving this space. I agreed, though public speaking had never been my strength. Some stories, I realized, needed to be told by those who had lived them. May arrived with an explosion of color throughout the neighborhood, not just in my garden, which had fully recovered its former glory, but in front yards and community spaces that had previously been maintained with sterile, uniform landscaping under the old HOA guidelines. Our revised rules emphasized sustainability and personal expression rather than conformity, encouraging native plantings, pollinator gardens, and food production. The result was a tapestry of diverse garden spaces that somehow created a more harmonious whole than the monotonous perfection previously enforced. The week before the community garden opening, I received an unexpected package by courier, a formal envelope bearing the seal of the district attorney's office. Inside was a brief letter informing me that my testimony would no longer be needed. Daniel Reynolds had provided comprehensive evidence against his co-conspirators, resulting in guilty pleas from all major participants in the scheme. Attached was a copy of the settlement agreement, which included substantial financial penalties and, most significantly for our neighborhood, a restitution fund to be distributed among communities affected by the Oakwood Network's activities. I read the document twice, focused on a particular clause near the end. Defendants acknowledge the harm caused to existing communities through their coordinated market manipulation and predatory acquisition strategies, and agree to the establishment of a community preservation fund to remediate damages. It wasn't a personal apology from Daniel Reynolds for destroying my garden. It wasn't even a direct acknowledgement of the individual pain he had caused. But it was something I hadn't expected. A systemic recognition that what had happened to us was wrong and deserved remedy. The community garden opening ceremony took place on a perfect spring day, the kind that showcases a neighborhood at its best. Over 200 residents gathered to celebrate not just a new amenity, but a symbol of their collective achievement. Edmund Meridian, despite his age, stood straight and proud as he addressed the crowd. "Development done right," he said, "doesn't replace community. It enhances what already exists and creates space for new connections to form." When my turn came to speak, I looked out at the gathered faces. Some I had known for decades, others new arrivals who had been drawn to our neighborhood precisely because of the community spirit that had emerged from our crisis. "A year and a half ago," I began, "my personal garden was partially destroyed in what I thought was simply a property dispute. What followed was the discovery of a scheme that threatened not just my garden but our entire community's character and accessibility." I gestured to the beautiful space around us. "Today, we stand in a different kind of garden, one created not by an individual but by an entire community working together. The same forces that tried to divide us for profit instead sparked a connection and cooperation that has made us stronger than before." As I spoke, I noticed a figure at the back of the crowd, a woman I didn't recognize watching intently. It was only later, during the reception, that she approached me directly. "Mrs. Bennett," she said, extending her hand. "My name is Claire Reynolds. Daniel is my father." I tried to mask my surprise, taking her hand automatically. She appeared to be in her early 30s, professionally dressed, with little physical resemblance to Daniel except perhaps around the eyes. "I wasn't expecting to see any of the Reynolds family here today," I said carefully. "I imagine not." Her expression was complex: embarrassment, determination, and something like regret. "I wanted to see this place for myself, to understand what happened here." "And what does your father think of your visit?" I couldn't help asking. Claire's mouth tightened slightly. "My father and I haven't spoken in some time. His business practices have been a point of contention between us for years." She glanced around at the community garden. "I'm an urban planner, Mrs. Bennett. I studied sustainable community development. You can imagine the dinner table arguments. I found myself reevaluating the young woman before me." "That must have been difficult." "Less difficult than what your community went through," she acknowledged. "I came here partly to apologize, though I know it's not my place, but also to learn. What happened here, both the negative and the positive, is something urban planning students should understand." We walked together through the garden as she explained her position at a university in a neighboring state, where she taught courses on community engagement in urban development. The Oakwood case, including our neighborhood's response, had become part of her curriculum. Your students know about my garden? I asked, somewhat bemused by the thought. They know about how a community organized to protect itself and then transformed a crisis into an opportunity for genuine improvement, she corrected. That's a case study worth teaching. As we approached the memorial corner where Robert's maple stood, she hesitated. There's one more thing. I found this among my father's possessions when I was helping clear out his house after he left the country. She reached into her bag and pulled out a weathered garden journal, its covers faded and water-stained. I recognized it immediately. It had disappeared during the excavator's destruction of my garden border. My garden diary, I said softly, taking it from her outstretched hand. I thought it was lost forever. He kept it for some reason, Claire said. I don't know why, but it seemed important, and it clearly wasn't his. I opened the journal carefully, finding my own handwriting documenting years of plantings, weather, observations, successes, and failures. Robert's occasional notes appeared in the margins, suggestions, compliments, observations in his precise handwriting. A pressed flower fell from between the pages, a forget-me-not I had preserved years ago. Thank you, I said, my voice thick with unexpected emotion. This means more than you know. As Claire prepared to leave, she paused one last time. What you've created here, it's remarkable. Not just the physical space, but the community behind it. My father never understood that development isn't just about buildings and profit margins. It's about nurturing what makes places worth living in. After she departed, I sat alone in the quiet corner of the garden, the recovered journal in my lap, surrounded by new growth emerging from soil that had been enriched by community care, rather than depleted by exploitation. Daniel Reynolds had destroyed part of my garden, thinking it a minor casualty in his grand scheme. He could never have imagined that his action would catalyze not just the protection of a neighborhood, but the creation of something more vibrant and resilient than what had existed before. In the journal's pages, I found a quote Robert had written years ago, his reflection after we had endured a particularly devastating storm that had damaged much of that year's planting. The garden teaches us that destruction is often the prelude to the most magnificent renewal, if we have the patience to nurture what remains and the wisdom to learn from what was lost. I ran my fingers over his handwriting, feeling a profound sense of connection, not just to him, but to the community that had become an extended family through our shared experience of threat and recovery. Daniel Reynolds had unknowingly set in motion a transformation far beyond anything he had intended. In trying to uproot our community, he had instead forced us to discover just how deep and interconnected our roots truly were, and how much stronger they could become when nurtured with collective purpose and care. 3 years later, I stood in my garden on a perfect summer evening, hosting our neighborhood's annual community celebration. What had begun as a simple potluck after our victory over Daniel Reynolds had evolved into a cherished tradition, a day when we commemorated not just what we had saved, but what we had created together. The community garden thrived beyond our expectations, now serving as a model studied by urban planners and community organizers from neighboring cities. The intergenerational center had become equally successful, with programs that brought together residents of all ages for everything, from technology workshops to cooking classes to oral history projects. My term as HOA president had ended the previous year. I had declined to run again, believing in the importance of rotating leadership. Sophia Chen now held the position, bringing fresh energy and ideas while maintaining the transparent, inclusive approach we had established. Daniel Reynolds had eventually served 6 months in a minimum security prison before being released on probation. The financial penalties had been far more significant, the loss of most of his assets and a lifetime ban from real estate development. According to his daughter Claire, with whom I maintained occasional correspondence, he had relocated to Florida, living modestly in a small condominium and working in his brother's insurance business. The Oakwood investigation had ultimately led to regulatory reforms at both state and federal levels, with new protections against predatory development tactics and enhanced transparency requirements for property acquisitions. Edmund Meridian had passed away peacefully the previous winter, leaving behind a legacy transformed by his final project. The Meridian Foundation, now led by Vanessa Kingsley, continued his community-focused approach to development, with our neighborhood serving as its flagship example. As twilight deepened and lights twinkled in the trees around my garden, I found myself sitting on the memorial bench near Robert's maple, which had grown substantially over the years. My old garden journal rested in my lap, its pages now supplemented with new entries documenting not just plants and seasons, but the growth of a community. Mr. Abernathy joined me, leaning heavily on his cane but smiling broadly. "Who would have thought," he said, gesturing toward the lively gathering, "that the day Daniel Reynolds destroyed your garden would turn out to be one of the best things that ever happened to this neighborhood?" I followed his gaze, watching neighbors of all ages talking, laughing, sharing food and stories. Children darted between garden beds on a scavenger hunt. Teenagers helped elderly residents navigate the pathways. New homeowners mingled with original residents, exchanging tips on native plantings and local history. "The garden teaches us that destruction is sometimes necessary for new growth," I replied, echoing Robert's words from my recovered journal. Though I could have done without the excavator. We shared a knowing laugh as night-blooming flowers opened around us, their fragrance filling the air, a reminder that even in darkness, life continues to unfold in unexpected and beautiful ways. The man who destroyed my garden had unwittingly planted something far more powerful. A community that had rediscovered its roots and would continue to bloom for generations to come.